It's the idea of, having that weekly all hands meeting. You look at the metrics, you go through what you've done, but then you also look at the SOP after you've looked at the metrics, because often that's the solution to the problem that you're having from a metric perspective.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm pleased today to be joined by Skye Waterson, who's the founder of Unconventional Organisation and specializes in helping founders with ADHD run a business that works for them. And we're going to be talking today about something that is super important, but I think is a challenge for a lot of people, which is documentation, standard operating procedures, having rails that your team can run on, and what Skye has learned from working with folks with ADHD about what works, not just for folks with ADHD, but I think things that we can all benefit from in terms of how to approach that in a smarter way. So with all of that, Skye, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to deep dive into this topic.
I am too. And before we get into all of that, I think your specialization and your specific focus on helping folks that have ADHD to be more successful, in particular entrepreneurs, is a fascinating one. I'd love to take a moment to dig into what you do and who you serve and kind of how you got here and what motivated you to start this business.
Yeah, so it was really a personal journey that became a business journey. I'm a former academic. I burned out incredibly hard between my master's and my PhD. I came from the school of just try harder, just add things to the list. It didn't work. And I ended up, quitting and not even sure if I was going to be able to come back to do academia after my master's. And it was really at that point that I realized I had to figure out what was going on with me. And I went to my university's learning center and I said, "Hey, I think I'm weird. Am I weird on is this a thing? Is it just me?" And they said, "Yep, you have. We think you have adult ADHD." And at that point, I was starting my PhD, so it all happened at once. But luckily, I had the research and the ability to find articles and things like that to really start to unlock what it meant to do something like a PhD and then later on like a business, as I grew and developed my own business and worked with other sort of executives and business owners, and do it in a way that works for our brain, so that we can leverage our strengths and support our weaknesses.
And so you've had a good run with this. You've supported hundreds of professionals. You've got tens of thousands of people that follow you online. You've become a real thought leader in this space. I'm really curious, before we dig into the specifics of standard operating procedures, what you've discovered about how an ADHD brain works, specifically in the context of running a business, being a leader, and what some of those first principles are that you think everyone can benefit from, that, like the strategies that have worked really well for those kinds of people, but they're actually just like fundamental best practices about how to organize things, how to approach your work in a way that works for the human brain.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I've been able to work with, governments and things like that as well. And one of the things I often get here is people saying, "Oh, this would actually be great for everyone." I'm like, yes, it would be great for everyone. Because at the end of the day, it's about flexibility. A lot of it is about looking at the way we've been taught to do something, 9 to 5, meeting with a little hour breaks in between to get some work done. Just do it in 10 minutes, just get started. All these things we get taught, and sort of, taking a moment to assess whether those things are actually what we should be doing or whether they're adjustments that are going to fit for you. And, I work with people who have ADHD symptoms. So a lot of them don't have diagnoses, but they struggle with the time blindness, the working memory, the it's just too boring, even though it would totally take my business to the next level. I just can't start it energy. And also just people who are in that more creative way of thinking. And we'll talk about that a little bit when it comes to the SOP pipeline, where the traditional way of working just doesn't work. And so it's really about complicating the conversation and saying, what if we don't do it like this? Okay, that's cool, but what is the research behind how we maybe should be thinking about how to do things?
Mm-hmm. So, with all that in mind, what are some of the, before we get into the SOP part, what are some of the important first principles that people should be aware of in terms of, like, if you are diagnosed or maybe you're undiagnosed, but you think you might be maybe you have some symptoms, or you resonate with the kinds of things that folks with ADHD describe in terms of their day to day. What are some of your sort of fundamental principles in terms of how to approach work differently in a way that is going to serve you better and be more productive?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the first thing I'd say is you might be right, because when we look at the research, entrepreneurs tend to be more likely to have ADHD. It's an environment that fits an ADHD brain better. So that's one of the reasons that we tend to gravitate towards it. In terms of how to work, what are the fundamental principles? I would say number one, and I'm just going to throw this out there, give yourself a reward for starting a task. The reward at the end doesn't seem to work as well. There's a bunch of neuroscience behind it that I could get into, but, think about, maybe giving yourself some kind of reward for getting into the zone on tasks. I've seen that take business owners from, putting things off for weeks to, I just got a call from a business owner who finally did some deep work this morning because he used that system. And the other one is, thinking about, okay, I'm going to probably need to write a few things down. Being the guy or woman who's in business, who is in a meeting, super enthusiastic, totally, let's do that. I'll follow up with you, et cetera, et cetera. Don't worry, I've got this. And then you didn't write it down, or maybe you wrote it in some, notebook somewhere, and now you've got this admin task list staring you back in the face that you put off for weeks and weeks. We don't want to do that. Let's find ways to avoid doing that. Anything you can do to take admin off your plate is going to be really helpful.
Mm. So with all that in mind, the topic du jour is standard operating procedures. It's, a very common discussion especially in our industry, creative digital agencies, consulting firms. You got to have processes, you got to have SOPs, you got to keep your documentation up to date. And all of this in principle, or in theory, I should say, sounds great. But in practice, there can be a ton of challenges. Creating those in the first place can be a really big pain in the butt, especially if you're not the kind of person that gets excited about that kind of thing. They go stale. People aren't actually using them. Keeping them up to date can be a real pain in the butt. So you've got an interesting take on this and a different approach that you found works really well for the people that you work with. Tell us a little bit about what some of those challenges are that you found people struggle with, and how you came up with this different way of doing it.
Yeah, 100%. So I started, like a lot of things, I was the person who was told, okay, it's time to build systems and processes for your business. And I was like, yeah, totally. We're going to do that. And then it just didn't happen. Or, I have a wonderful team member who likes building systems and processes, but it wasn't connected to anything. So she would build a system and I'd be like, you built a system, right? And she'd be like, yeah, I built a system. And I'd be like, cool. And that was about as far as it went. And so for a while, this was a bit of one of those moments of, people would say systems and processes, and I'd be like, oh, I'm not doing it. And then I noticed, with business owners that it was the same thing. It was like, that's amazing, but I'm not going to do it. And one of the reasons was because there was a sense that it was not useful, genuinely. It was one of those things where people are like, I'm going to have a member of my team who likes building out systems and processes, write this doc, and then it's going to go in a file. It used to be big paper, but now it's, it's going to go in a Google Drive, and it's going to be out of date in about 10 minutes. And we're never going to use it to actually grow the business or figure out what's working. And it's just going to gather dust until a new person generally until a new person arrives on the scene. And we say, look at the SOPs. And they go, but you guys don't even use that system anymore. Like, this is just unhelpful information. And it felt like this kind of like secret problem that people weren't talking about because it was never as flashy as like the dashboard conversation. Let's look at your dashboards, let's look at your metrics, but it was driving some of the problems with the dashboard itself.
Yeah. So you've raised all of I think that story is all too common where it's like you delegate this, the SOP gets created, then it doesn't actually get used at all. So you're kind of like, what was the point? And I guess the point was maybe like create some redundancy. And then the moment where that redundancy kicks in, it's like, hey, this hasn't been touched in 10 months. And yeah, it's like where's the login for this tool? Oh, we canceled that 8 months ago. Great. Okay. And so, you've got a bit of a different approach to this. Tell us a little bit about how you do this differently and what some of the key principles are there.
Yeah. So there's two really key points where I realized that this could be shifted. Number one is, when I work with, people like you and amazing people like Matt Verlack, all the conversation is about having a cadence when we're talking about dashboards. We're talking about numbers. We don't want numbers to be something we look at once a month. We want them to be something we look at once a week, the important ones. We want to see what's red, what's orange, what's moving, what's not moving. And I realized that SOP systems are very similar. We need to bring them into the light. And especially if you're somebody who has ADHD, we need to work on them together. But it's almost impossible to do while they're a big pile of folders. And one of the things that, the other thing is that when I'm working with creatives and entrepreneurs and who, struggle with ADHD symptoms, is a lot of times it's more of a visual format that's going to work. There's a ton of reasons for this. There's actually some research around, a connection between issues like dyslexia or processing disorders where some things are just not going to be processed as effectively, large, giant blocks of text being one of them. And so I realized that, when I have had problems in the past, I'll often draw a flow chart. And we think about this with the business. And it was actually, I was very inspired by your book, the SaaS book, which I'm sure you've talked about before, but I want to give it a shout out here, which is such a great book in terms of what that flow would look like. Because in reality, your business is, acquisition, how to, at the end of the day, it's how do people come through? How do you find new, strangers? How do you warm them up? How do you sell to them? How do you retain them if you can? How do you expand on, those customers if you can? That's every business. And I will say I've since worked on this business model with people who have $64 million businesses, people who have their first $100,000 business. And it's always amazing the people who have the multi-million-dollar businesses who are like, oh, we are not doing acquisition. We're relying on referrals. Like this bit is completely missing. So the first thing to do is just to create a flow chart of, the high level. What does it look like to get clients? Are you doing paid ads? Are you doing earned media? And then they come through here and they do this and they do that. And you've got that flow chart as you go down so that everybody can at least see, and everyone can see this very quickly in a meeting. I'm going to try not to go too far into the weeds here. I love this topic, but everyone can see it, oh, this is how our business works. This is how we make money. Because surprisingly often people don't know that.
So, by the way, the weeds are welcome here. This is a show that we like to get into the weeds. So what you've described, I think, makes a lot of sense. So break the business down into its sort of core components, which, across every business, basically the same things: attract people, convert those people, deliver what you said you were going to deliver to them, retain them, and expand them. You could rename those, reorganize them, but like largely that's the flow. And so you visualize this in some kind of a tool. I'm a big fan of Miro, potato. I don't know what the right, but I'm very drawn to, if I'm trying to get something out of my head and to communicate, or if I'm having a meeting, like I'm constantly in Miro visualizing things. Are there some other tools that you recommend for that step of the process, visualizing things that you've had success with?
So Miro is the one that I use as well. I'm a big fan of Miro, and we'll go into a little bit of why, because it allows you to link people's responsibilities, and we're going to end up with a thing that's colored red, orange, or green that has the person responsible and has a link to the SOP on it. That's what we're aiming for to build. But there's lots of different options out here. So any kind of digital mind map option is going to work for you. I highly recommend you do not do the paper version. I was that person who was like, I'm just going to draw it on paper. And then I spent ages drawing it on paper. And then you know what? It stayed on paper because, because I didn't actually then go ahead and put it. This is a dopamine thing, but the dopamine was gone. I already knew what it looked like. I felt that relief of understanding my business, and then I never did it again. So I do recommend in this case going with a tech tool. I try and make things as physical as possible for people who need that. But in this case, digital tech tool is what you're looking for.
Yeah. Awesome. So a couple of recommendations there. Miro for sure. Stormboard, Whimsical, or a free one is diagram.io, which connects to Google, and you can like drop those things. So all good options. There's a gazillion other ones out there, but yeah, a great recommendation. So you start with mapping out the kind of core business functions. What happens next, Skye?
Yes. So the next thing you do is you realize what's broken or what you've got too much of. And this is one of the reasons I like doing this with ADHD clients as well. I myself have an entire section of like disconnected nodes where I would thought this was going to be part of what we did. And then you just keep simplifying it. So you end up with a hopefully simple business flow. You understand where everything's going. The next step for you is to go, okay, well, who is responsible for each of these pieces? And it has to be one person. I work with a lot of business owners who say, oh, well, it's a team effort. I'm like, that's exciting. But when bad things happen, who is the person that we're going to say, like, this has to be done? And sometimes people will put their name, and then that's when they realize they haven't delegated. But we want to have one person who's responsible for each of these pieces. So who's responsible for your paid ads? Who's responsible for making sure that the emails that come through are like, you've got a newsletter going out and it's, regular. Who's responsible for that sales? You want to go ahead and put somebody's name, tag somebody's name on each of those little pieces.
So we assign directly, I think we refer to that as the DRI, the direct responsible individual, to each of those kind of critical business areas. Then where do we go from there?
Well, at this point, you're probably thinking, Skye, you've made an organizational chart. Well done. But the thing that we want to do next is we want to look at, okay, this is not just a system that we're going to look at once and be like, this is great. This is who's here. This is something that we're building on. So the next thing we want to go through is we want to actually identify these nodes as red, orange, or green. Red means it's broken. Sometimes you have a node where you're just like, we haven't actually even set up this paid ads conversation. We thought about it. We realized it was important. We've been living off referrals for a while, and we just haven't done this. So this is red. Orange means it's being done, but I get a million Slack messages a day. There's no SOP system. The CEO is being messaged, multiple times a day about this topic. Every time there's a question, it has to go through them. So really, this is like a hand crank process at this point. This is not actually done. And then green is there is an SOP doc. It works. It works without the CEO's involvement 99% of the time. And it's the team is running it and it's getting you those ROI results that you're looking for. So that's essentially what you want to do. You want to go through, you want to give everything a color. And then from there, you want to plug that into your weekly meeting, your all hands meeting that you're having with your team. And if you're not having one, you should talk to Matt, because Matt Verlack knows how to teach you how to do those. But it's the idea of, having that weekly all hands meeting. You look at the metrics, you go through what you've done, but then you also look at the SOP after you've looked at the metrics, because often that's the solution to the problem that you're having from a metric perspective.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. I think this is a really interesting idea of, it's really a different take on how you organize and visualize your SOPs. And I think in many ways, you're ideally doing this where it's aligned to your metrics as well. I think you've touched on this, but like really explicitly, it's like, okay, well, we have acquisition, we have conversion, we have delivery, we have retention, we have expansion. Presumably you're measuring all of those things. And presumably you're going to have insight into like what is or isn't on track. And then the flip side of that conversation is, well, let's go have a look at how those things are doing macro and micro in terms of like, are they red, yellow, or green in terms of the processes that we have in place there? And I think it stands to reason that you'd probably expect to see a correlation. And even if you didn't see a correlation between like this area is red and the numbers aren't good, let's say an area is all green and the numbers aren't good, then it begs the question of like, are we doing the wrong things in this area? Like we have a great process that's actually the wrong process.
Yeah, 100%. And that's the funny conversation. And then to the SOP part really comes in is every single one of those nodes, if it's not red, if it's orange or green, needs to have a link to the SOP doc. So instead of somebody saying, oh, I need to figure out how to do this particular section, or I wonder how this person is actually setting up our Instagram, reels. Like, I don't even know how that's working, like the pipeline for that. They should be able to click into the Miro board or whatever you're using, open the SOP directly from there, read it, and have a sense of what this person is doing or not doing. That is the key difference. And when we're working as a team, that's often the thing. So to your example, if the numbers are red, but the SOP pipeline is green over there, then we're saying, well, this is your SOP. Can you double click on that for me in this meeting? And can we have a look at this piece and see what's going on? So it's very in public, the conversation.
Mm-hmm. This is a powerful idea as well, because, one of the challenges that comes up around SOPs is they aren't delivering business value because they're not being used. They get created, and then the person that's doing that job knows how to do it. So they don't, actually use the SOP. And everybody talks about having the always open culture, but it's a lot harder to do in practice, right? Like I think the common trope around this is like, oh, well, like an airline pilot goes through their checklist before they take off every single time, even though they've done it 1,000 times. So it's like, yeah, but people die if they don't do that. So, it's not the case that people die if you publish a social media post and there's a typo in it, and so like, I think that that's a real challenge, but this is really interesting because I think the fact that they're all linked there is sort of a forcing function for these to get investigated. And I think actually back to something that I have a tendency to do, which is like, okay, I'm looking at my metrics. I'm seeing that there's a part of the business that's underperforming. And then I want to go and understand, like, what are we doing in this area of the business? I think this is increasingly important as there's a team, because it's like, I don't actually know how things happen in my own business. Like, I couldn't tell you what happens between when we finish this recording and this gets published on LinkedIn as a clip, or on, like, I have a rough idea, but I have very little insight actually into like what is happening. But if we were having challenges or issues with our podcast performance, for example, then the next logical thing to do would be to say, okay, let me go understand how we do things today so that I can understand if there's opportunity in this process, if there are gaps, if there's a misalignment, right. And this makes that very highly observable even before that conversation happens. And I think creates a really good container for that conversation to happen. And I think a natural surface area where you're more likely to see where SOPs are out of date, out of line, not current, because of the way that this is organized and the way it lends itself to having it be investigated, even if it's not necessarily being used all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this was something that I found with not just myself, but obviously I work with ADHD entrepreneurs. And so it was this case of scaling chaos. Otherwise, you're just driving faster and faster down a highway with no headlights on, going like you said, like, oh my gosh, I started a podcast. That's so exciting. And we have a system and I hope it's working and I don't really know what it is. And, it's just more and more and more of that as you add more people. And that makes it hard for you to see, is what they're doing actually affecting you. So that's why we keep it in that acquisition, lead sales conversation, because sometimes people are just off in a corner doing something that relates to nothing. And is it optimized? And also, I am not going to go into a giant folder called SOPs and search for this SOP. I'm never going to do that. It's much easier for me to go, well, at this point, it's broken because the sale didn't go through. So let me click on this section and see what the process was here. And that kind of brings me to the delegation conversation, which we don't necessarily have time to go into in terms of, okay, cool, but how do people create SOPs? I do have an AI chat bot that just takes you through that process of how to build how to get your team to build SOPs. So if you guys want to message me, you can message me, Marcel, at Unconventional Organisation on Instagram. I'll just give that to you. And hopefully that will help you build your team system of delegation, because I know that's kind of the next question people tend to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we do have a little bit of time to get into some of the best practices there, because I think it is important, right? You ask somebody to develop an SOP. There's a lot of schools of thought on this. And frankly, the tools are getting much better. AI has, I think, greased the wheel on this quite a lot, and it has changed the game. I think it's also made it more accessible to people who prefer different modalities. Certainly, I'm not the kind of person who could write an SOP. So I was much more of a video first kind of SOP creator. That has gotten a lot easier now that I can convert that much more quickly into a written document. Also, the usage of SOPs, I think, has gotten a lot easier, where we have really leaned into Notion. But I mean, this exists everywhere. Basically, the documents are stored where it's the SOP is there, but I'm interacting with an AI chatbot that's reading the SOP and then distilling it down or walking me through step by step, right? So there is actually, I think, a lot more surface area for the SOP delivering value and actually being used while the work is being done because of this technology, which I think is pretty exciting. So with all of that being said, yeah, what are some of your best practices in terms of how you enable your team to create and maintain SOPs without it taking up all of their time or feeling like a huge chore?
And this is really important, because one of the things that my team member actually said to me a couple of months ago when we were sort of, continuing to work on this is, oh, this SOP is never going to be finished. Because she had this sense, in her mind that an SOP was something that you built and then it was done. It was kind of rubber stamped and put in a box. And the realization that, well, we're a small growing team. So this is a working draft forever. And that shift really helped a lot with relaxing into the sense of, okay, we're always going to be breaking things in our flow, rebuilding things in our flow. This is going to be a part of what everyone's doing. But in terms of that initial delegation, one of the best things to do is you really want to empower the person who is responsible to become the owner of that SOP. Yes, when you're a pilot, there are things you just have to do and you have to just tick it off, like you said in that example. But really, with a lot of what we're doing, we actually want that person to look at it and say, yeah, this is cool, but maybe we should try this, or maybe we should do it like that. We want that sort of, or there's a new system that's going to make this even faster or even better in terms of the process. So one of the ways that I do that, I recommend people do that, is when you, and the chatbot I was talking about goes through this, but when you start, just start by, finding your favorite, audio or written AI, chatting to it and saying, okay, I need you to help me create, I want to delegate this task to this person. This is the North Star, this is why it's happening. This is kind of the recipe. This is how I would do it. Oh, I forgot. Step 3 is actually this, and I would need to give them access to this, and blah, blah, blah. And give them a little thing that just says, and a copy paste of that conversation your AI comes up with and spits out, this is the North Star, this is the checklist. And then when you use the chatbot with us, it comes with a little message as well. And actually just wholesale take that conversation, give it to the person using whatever chat platform you guys use, and say, hey, this is AI. This is not perfect, but this is essentially what this task looks like. Can you review these steps, try it, see how far you get, and come to me with questions? Let's book a 15, 30-minute meeting. where you start to own the process, you ask me questions, and then you're able to start to feel responsibility. And also sometimes you'll say, oh, I think the AI got this wrong because I don't really think we should do it like this. And it's not the AI, it was me. And that's fine because you're allowing your team member to build on what you're doing.
I think that there's something really interesting here in that, you've touched on an important tension, which is over-engineering process too early in a business, or maybe too early in a part of the business that is nascent, that is changing, that is immature, whatever, can actually create more cost than it does benefit, right? And that it's creates this massive SOP that now needs to be maintained, and it slows down the pace of change. And like, it is very easy to over engineer a process. And so, the best practice that I've learned around this is you kind of start with basically determining what the exit criteria is. So like, when you're done, like, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but like, when you're done, these things should be true. This is how you know you've done a good job. There's no mistakes, there's no typos, the date is this, all the merge fields work, etc. And like, then you can send the email. And so like, that could be the starting point. There could be a checklist. You might start to define some of these steps. And I think this is where like the idea that instead of thinking of it as an SOP document, it's a set of criteria that informs a chatbot that then helps facilitate the process by which someone gets the work done, takes that idea and makes it so much more useful. Because, if you think like, and I think that this is just a macro trend of like where we're going with this is like, we're not going to be reading SOP documents really in the future. We're going to have our AI agent open. And I think in the future, like the majority of our workday is going to be having this AI agent facilitate our day and be like, this is what you have to do next. And let me prompt you with a question, and like, let's start getting it done. And it's just going to be a question of telling that agent, here's what you need to prompt the user for, and here's what you need to validate is there, and here's what you need to watch out for in order for these things to get the outcomes that we want. And it will enable a lot more fluidity in the process itself without necessarily creating a whole bunch of risk that you're going to have the wrong outcomes. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's exciting for the team. One of the things I often find is people with ADHD symptoms, and I think a lot of people in general, can be really reluctant to delegate. They're like, I don't want people to see how messy my system is and how bad it is, and what if it's not right? And so they'll do this thing where they'll be like, I'll write, even with the chatbot, they'll make a chatbot and then they'll put it in a Google Doc and they'll say, I will review it and I'll make sure it's perfect, and then I'll send it to them, and then it will just sit there for 3 months. But your team usually wants you to delegate. I've never spoken to an entrepreneur where I say, okay, well, this person, do they want to take this task off your list? And they're like, yes, they're begging me to take this task. They want more, not they want more stuff, but they want important stuff. And so if you're sitting there and you're kind of, holding on to it and not letting it go, you're disempowering your team, which is incredibly bad for the culture.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of important things here. Do you have any final words of advice for folks as it relates to this idea of visualizing the organization of standard operating procedures and creating SOPs? Anything else that gets in people's way that you want to address before we wrap up today?
I think it's really important to make this part of your weekly meeting cadence. And it's tough to do. But when you say, when we look at the dashboard, then we'll look at the SOP, even just at a high level, is this still orange? Is this still red? That kind of thing. It takes it away from this, we only look at it when somebody new arrives, or we only look at it when it's broken. It's conversation, and you can actually start to do something very similar, which you can say, hey, this was orange, but I think it's green now. Go you, like you're doing a great job. And it gives the same kind of respect to the processes that are in many ways the reason that you're getting those dashboard metrics that you're looking for.
I think that's a really insightful idea. So with all of this, Guy, you mentioned a couple of resources that we're going to have in the show notes. You mentioned the book that I co-wrote with Matt, actually, so I'll have a link to that. I'll have a link to Matt. You mentioned your AI chatbot, so we'll have instructions on how to get that from you, which will be a DM on Instagram. Is there anywhere else that people should go in the show notes if they want to learn more about you and some of the stuff you've talked about today?
Yeah, so you can find me at Unconventional Organisation on the internet. And if you want to learn more, I have a podcast called the ADHD Skills Lab. We had Marcel on, which was really great. I go into, I interview business owners with ADHD. I talk about research into ADHD brains and how we work and why we work that way. So lots of resources there as well.
Amazing. So we'll have links to Skye's information, Unconventional Organization, the podcast in the show notes. So definitely go check that out. And with all of that, Skye, thank you for making the time to be on the show today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.